Welcome back, everybody. I'm pleased to tell you this is the last time you're going to have to look at me today, so we've come to a milestone. I want to take a moment and ask all the speakers on this and all the other panels to applaud the audience, which has been extraordinary. That is also a moment to tell you that the Slido is off and we're not taking questions anymore. So this is a session where we turn to just hearing a set of standalone ideas about the future. Does anyone know what you're looking at here?
First space shuttle.
So this is the golden record, so-called, that was sent with Voyager 1 in 1977, four years after Roe, to reach Mars and possibly continue beyond the galaxy. And I see an analogy, and you'll find it strange, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. I see an analogy between the project of this record and the project of this panel. So the golden record contained greetings in many major languages and music that ranged from Bach preludes, and by the way, Bach is heavily overrepresented, which could be a conference in itself, to Peruvian panpipes, to Indonesian gamelan, to Chuck Berry. It was meant to be a record of human achievement and possibility that would stand the ultimate test of time and distance and be picked up by extraterrestrials. So surely greater distance than that separates us today. Our final panelists are putting their statements onto our golden record, going from the age of Roe into the age of Dobbs. They're not asked to respond to or endorse each other's visions, but merely to stand side by side or to lay side by side as tracks on our record at this historical juncture, looking ahead to what the state of play might be, could be, can't be, should be as we move forward. To moderate this conversation and introduce the panelists in groups, please welcome my colleague and dear friend Jill Lepore, who is the David Woods Kemperer 41 Professor of History here at Harvard, a New Yorker staff writer, and the author of pretty much everything. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. And thanks, Jane, for this whole conference, which has really been a revelation and an inspiration to me for the kind of civic discourse, intellectual exchange, and academic community that is the Radcliffe Institute at its best, and I think also showcases the revelations to be found in the collections of the Schlesinger Library. So it's my great honor to introduce this incredible lineup of all-stars to end this conference. We're tasked here to think about the age of Dobbs. That is looking ahead even unto, say, the next 50 years. But I'm a historian, and I have a very hard time thinking about the future and very little authority with which to do so. So I want to just spend a minute thinking about what the future looked like 50 years ago, which, as Jane's invocation of the Voyager golden record suggests, was something that Americans in particular were really fixated on. The 1960s and 1970s were really kind of a heyday for obsession with the future. I mean, if you think of the kind of Elon Musk Mars colonization moment that we live in now as one that is obsessed with the future, it is very much a redo of the 1960s and 1970s. And I have just a couple quick images I want to show before I then introduce our panelists. That vision of the future was really marked out in the 1960s by this set of images. This really extraordinary photograph of what was in fact a terminated pregnancy on the cover of Life magazine in 1965, set in an aquarium. So as this fetus looked as though it were floating through space, an image that so inspired Stanley Kubrick that it became the iconographic representation of 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968. Even the movie poster invoked this fetus. And I want to just suggest to you that in the age of Roe, a particular publicly present vision of the future was one in which humanity itself was at risk of extinction. and in particular, this vision of white humanity. In a period of civil rights struggle, in a period of the women's liberation movement, in a period of post-colonial struggle, in a period of the United States of immigration reform, 1965 is the Immigration Act, opening the United States borders that had been effectively closed since 1924, that eugenics moment that has been so often invoked. This vision of the future, the vulnerability, the fragility of humanity in the face of the extraordinary changes on Earth. Think of 1969, the Apollo 13 lands on the moon, 1970, the first Earth Day. So that when you think about science fiction of this era, 1971, say to 73, 1968 is Planet of the Apes. So think about that as a vision of the future and the kinds of anxiety that it represents. You see that again and again and again in science fiction films from this period. 1971 is Omega Man. Charlton Heston with his rifle is the last fully human defending the planet against essentially non-white humans who are mutants. The Andromeda strain is sort of similar story in which a virus from outer space risks human extinction, can only be defeated by certain American astronauts. And Soylent Green, Soylent Green is people, the poor are eating the poor. The concerns about overpopulation, thermonuclear war, pollution, environmental collapse, political revolution that animated fears and uncertainties about the future are very much in the fore of the moment when Roe is being debated, argued before the Supreme Court, and when the opinion is being issued. And these dystopian visions coexist alongside feminist, Afrofuturist science fiction that is often equally dystopian, but also tends to be more inclined toward utopianism. Think about Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, imagining an alternative world where there is no gender, where humans take turns giving birth, where they can switch genders at will. Joanna Russ's The Female Man, a kind of redo of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland. And Octavia Butler's Patent Master, a dystopia about a eugenics-driven future. So I just want to suggest, as we think about looking ahead from this moment, that Roe had its own vision of the future. It existed in a moment in time, much like our moment in time, in which our visions of the future are very much manufactured by our concerns in the present. As I think much of the really amazing commentary today and yesterday has revealed to us. So I want to explain now, having used up my brief moments here, I want to explain how our panel is going to work, because it's different than all of the rest. We won't be having a discussion. There won't be Slido questions. There are, in fact, a large number of panelists, and we're going to be taking the stage in threes, giving a lightning round of presentations on three kind of different broadly based topics. So our first set of incredibly distinguished panelists is going to be talking essentially about ethics. We have an ethics kind of mini panel, a law mini panel, and then a medicine mini panel we might broadly suggest. And so I'll introduce our speakers three at a time. I'll be back up here in a couple of moments. Evelynn Hammonds is the Barbara Gutmann Rosenkrantz Professor in the History of Science and African and African American Studies here at Harvard. She is a specialist in the histories of science, medicine, and public health in the United States. And as with all of our speakers, you can read more in the full biographies that are linked in the program guide. Evelynn Cohen is the James Attwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law and Deputy Dean of the Harvard Law School and Faculty Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology and Bioethics, and is a specialist on the intersection of bioethics and the law. And Erika Bachiochi is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute, and founder and director of the Wollstonecraft Project, where she specializes in equal protection jurisprudence, feminist legal theory, Catholic social teaching, and sexual ethics. So I want to first invite my colleague, Evelynn Hammonds.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks also to all the organizers. I am truly honored to be a part of this convening. As we consider the future of access to abortion and reproductive justice in this country, It will be important to consider the broadest possible historical context that brought us to where we are today, and Jill laid out some of the major issues there. How did we get here to a place where increasingly the regulation of reproductive rights has been given over entirely to the states? Many observers have rightfully noted that questions about abortion, including women's access to a safe and legal abortion, effective contraception, good and affordable maternal and prenatal care, as well as relief from poverty, are also questions about the basic human right to bodily autonomy. More pointedly, it is a history of the denial of the right to bodily autonomy for those who bear a disproportionate burden of the consequences of that denial, all poor women and Black, brown, and indigenous women of all classes. And I want to specifically point to the ways in which this history is also about the erasure of Black women from the Constitution, as Michelle Goodwin has so eloquently put it. We must begin the historical understanding of how we got to this place today by putting the history of the long and persistent efforts to control the fertility and reproduction of Black women by white men at the center of our narratives. We might begin by asking, who has bodily autonomy in this country? How did they get it, and on what terms, and to achieve what goals? Unlike white Christian men, the historical record shows that, quote, Black women's procreation has been forced, monetized, and monitored since they arrived on U.S. shores. This did not unfold organically or naturally. It was done for specific reasons to support specific goals that should be named. Naming the acts that led to and sustained the denial of bodily autonomy to certain women is key to understanding where we are today. And as Michelle also noted, Black women have consistently pointed to the need for making this long history more visible in our public conversations about the impact of abortion restrictions on all women today. Throughout our history, Black women have fought for their right to have rights, to have bodily autonomy. At this contemporary moment, Black women scholars, activists, and advocates consistently demand that bodily autonomy not be understood as simply an individual right, but rather should be understood as a right of individuals in community. Therefore, they demand, as the African American Policy Forum statement states, quote, not just for bodily autonomy over our reproductive organs, but also autonomy from violence of the state and other extrajudicial killings by the police. We mean autonomy over our gender and our sexual experiences. We mean autonomy over our families and the right to raise our children in safe and supported communities. An important aspect of where we are today in discussions of the denial of abortion rights is the absence of the history of the practices that made denial possible. If knowing our history is key to making a better future, then studying this history must be protected too. In 2022, the American Historical Association documents more than 18 states that now have enacted restrictions and or limitations on the teaching of the themes in U.S. history relating to African Americans, women's history, LGBTQ history, among other topics. The same white male legislators who have enacted abortion restrictions are the same ones restricting the study of U.S. history. Thus, the very history we need to understand today is under attack. I grew up in Georgia, where I attended public schools in the 1950s. Whites controlled the curriculum in all the schools in the segregated school system. As Bethany Bell wrote in the Washington Post this week, the textbooks were chosen because they emphasized that the, quote, Civil War was not rebellion, enslaved people had been treated well, and the war between the states was not fought over slavery. The hand-me-down textbooks I was taught from never mentioned any aspect of Black American life or history. So I stand here today as someone who was systematically denied both reproductive justice and the history I needed to challenge that historic injustice. Thus bringing the history that has been erased to visibility and interrogating the current backlash to such efforts is key to understanding how we got to where we are today. And it also amplifies what advocates of abortion rights need to consider going forward from this moment. As Jill noted, historians do not predict the future, but some of us use our work to remind us all about what the past can tell us about the present in order to imagine a specific and different future. In 50 years, I want to see a world where the lived experiences of African American women, all poor women, and women of color are no longer relegated to the margins of our public commitments to bodily autonomy, but rather their lives and their full rights as citizens would finally be enshrined in the Constitution of this country. Thank you. It is my pleasure to invite my colleague, Glenn Cohen, to the podium.
Thank you so much. So my goal is to provoke you, and I want to provoke it by talking about frontiers in three senses, although maybe we can think of them in some ways as Rubicons, especially for the pro-life views. So to simplify somewhat, I'm going to suggest that individuals who are pro-life typically subscribe to two premises. The first is that fetuses are persons and or get some of the rights of persons from early on in their development, particularly the right of inviolability. The second premise is that whatever interest the mother has in protecting her bodily integrity, her reproductive autonomy, does not outweigh the fetus's right of inviolability. If you adopt those two premises, I think there are three interesting frontiers for the future: geographical, moral, and technological. First, the geographical frontier. The Dobbs majority claims that they want to return abortion to individual states to set their own policy. But that assumes a conception of the morality of abortion that is tied to territoriality. If one takes the pro-life premises seriously, there's no reason why a state should not seek to extend its prohibition on abortion as far as it possibly can geographically. It is an imperial conception of moral status. To use pro-life language, if one believes abortion is the killing, to use the language of some of the statutes, of an unborn child, and one prohibits it for that reason, why would one want to permit a parent to transport that child from a state that prohibits that killing to a place where it is permitted? In work I did while a Radcliffe Fellow many years ago on medical tourism, I talked about how Ireland faced exactly the situation. I'm mindful of the comment from an earlier speaker is Ireland, don't take any lessons, so let me take some other examples. We have prohibitions in many countries on transporting somebody from a place where female genital cutting is unlawful to a place where it is lawful, and we extend criminal law in that reason. Why is abortion any different from that? Why is abortion different from many other areas where we do think it is proper to extend criminal law? More philosophically, it seems plausible to me that what should matter is citizenship and not the physical territoriality. That is, if you are part of a political community that prohibits abortion and views the fetus as a person who is already a member of your political community and has an interest in its preservation for that reason, why would you permit its transport elsewhere? On the pro-life premises, permitting the life of the fetus to depend on whether its mother can drive to reach another state seems little better than permitting abortion only on some days of the week but not others. It seems a moral arbitrariness. So I think this is a Rubicon that pro-life views are going to have to wrestle with. And while Justice Kavanaugh, in the Dobbs opinion, writing only for himself, seems to indicate somewhat blithely that he thinks that the Constitution bars a state from prohibiting travel for abortion, in my view, having read the precedents, the matter is far from clear as a constitutional matter, and I think this is going to be a legal question we are going to face in the next 10 or 15 years. Second, the moral frontier. Why stop with fetuses? Why should those who subscribe to pro-life views not also seek to prohibit embryo destruction, including the discard of excess embryos created via in vitro fertilization? This is not implausible in that many countries limit embryo creation to those which you can implant in a single cycle, and indeed Louisiana has since the 1980s prohibited the destruction intentionally of embryos. There is a way that prohibiting the destruction of embryos is actually an easier conclusion on the pro-life premises than is prohibiting abortion. Why? Prohibiting abortion depends on that second premise, the idea that there is an interest in bodily autonomy among women that is overcome by the rights of fetuses. That same premise is not activated in the case of embryo destruction. No woman is gestating an embryo at that point. There is no forced gestation, merely non-destruction or non-creation. Now, there are claims as to reproductive but not gestational autonomy here, but I think they're weaker than the claims as to gestation. And yet, most pro-life views have not yet, at least, in open conversation, crossed into the question of embryo destruction. Now, pro-life views do have a way out. They can press on that first premise and say only fetuses and not embryos are persons. That requires them, though, to defend an answer as to why personhood attaches to one but not the other. And there are views out there like this. Some believe that personhood only begins at the 14th day when embryonic twinning is no longer possible. But the most common political manifestations of personhood across America started at the point of fertilization, which seems to reject exactly this distinction. The last frontier is technological, and here I'm going to take Professor Lepore's invitation to be a little science fictional here and talk about a possible future of ectogenesis, that is, gestation outside the womb. To be clear, currently the science of the development of the science has been animal models for artificial wombs for potentially sustaining a prematurely delivered newborn. That's not the same thing as gestation from the beginning outside of a womb or even transfer to an artificial womb, but perhaps there's a future where this becomes a possibility. What should the pro-life movement think about this kind of future and whether to support this kind of work? If transfer became possible, would prohibiting abortion be easier to justify? That is, can we distinguish a right to stop gestating from a right to terminate a fetus? In some ways, the artificial womb would play a parallel role to that adoption plays in the current discourse among pro-life individuals. Adoption is offered as an alternative that was not taken, and the fact that that alternative is used to diminish women's interest in abortion. This would make the same move, but focus on the alternative women have during pregnancy, not after. The artificial womb, though, would put pressure on some of the discourse about the natural that is also very much historically connected to the pro-life movement, even not a premise that it depends upon. Well, as I said, my goal has been to provoke you. Hopefully you feel very provoked, and I'm very glad to welcome the last speaker to the dais.
Two very difficult acts to follow, of course. It's great to be with you all. So on one reading of human history, it might be said that moral progress can be measured by the steady and progressive extension of the circle of moral concern to classes of human beings that prior eras had left excluded. Blind spots in one historical era have often been mercifully corrected in another. We come to see dignity among fellow humans that had not been seen, that something more is owed, that we are responsible to these others in a way that had not been recognized before. As a student of political theory, law, and the history of women's rights, and a one-time pro-choice advocate, I've long been animated by just this question of who is inside and outside the circle of moral concern. It's a question that, politically speaking, often justly culminates in rights claims, but it really begins when individuals and then communities ask what we owe the vulnerable other. In this vein, I have come to believe that our country's earliest women's rights advocates, wrong though some were on matters of race, have something to teach us about our fulsome responsibilities to unborn children and their mothers that our era has seemed to forget. The 19th century feminists lived their lives wise to the human reality of interdependence, a reality that begins for each and every one of us as a developing child sharing our own mother's body in the very first bond of human solidarity. Though always burdensome and sometimes a joy, the existentially interdependent relation of pregnant mother to unborn child is not best understood by analogy to voluntarily contracted market relations, much less property ownership, but is itself paradigmatic, I think, for all other human relations. At every stage of our lives, after all, we humans are deeply vulnerable and dependent, in need of nurturing and hospitable environments to develop and grow. An equality or liberty or marketplace or medicine that does not see our most basic existential need for nurture and the duties of care that need calls forth from others is not recognizably human. In the way I've come to see it, and the Dobbs dissent only vindicates my view. Abortion rights in Roe and Casey were grounded on a male normative account of liberal autonomy, one that takes the male-bodied capacity to walk away from an unexpected pregnancy as the measure of women's reproductive equality and liberty. But such atomizing autonomy is an inhumane way to ground the rights of interdependent human beings. In sharp contrast, the 19th century women's rights advocates did not agitate for the right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, to imitate that violent domination that women too often experience at the hands of men. Rather, these women agitated for rights to co-equal education, entry into the professions within marriage and in civil and political life so that they, alongside men, could carry out their shared duties of care in their families and beyond. Now, we could certainly look back on the 19th century feminists and claim, as the dissenting justices do in Dobbs, that they just didn't understand what it was to enjoy that kind of autonomy over their bodies. But it would be far better to try to understand these women as they understood themselves, as women who knew they were mothers with all the responsibilities of motherhood, not when their children were born, but when they were still developing in their mother's wombs. Indeed, these women sought control of and sovereignty over their own bodies, what they called voluntary motherhood, knowing full well that they had no authority to willfully dispose of the body of another, their own unborn child. So consider, for one instance, Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president and testify before Congress and an ardent advocate of constitutional equality for women. Woodhull recognized that mothers were, quote, directly charged with the care of embryonic life. For children's rights as individuals, she wrote, quote, begin while yet they remain the fetus. Like her peers in the 19th century women's rights movement, Woodhull saw little difference between the crime of infanticide and, quote, destroying life in its embryonic condition. For it is, she wrote, the self-same life that is taken. Similarly, in her popular 1889 book, Toxology, OBGYN Alex Stockham leaned on mid-19th century advances in embryology to disabuse her readers of the view that, quote, there's no harm in arresting pregnancy previous to the feeling of motion, or what we would say is quickening. Dr. Stockham continues, quote, by what false reasoning does the woman convince herself that another life, still more dependent upon her for its existence, with equal rights and possibilities, has no claim upon her for protection? These women saw abortion for exactly what it was, but they also saw women's lives for exactly what they were. And so they wished, as Matilda Gage put it, to, quote, reach the root of the evil and destroy it. What was the root of the evil of abortion? That many women, according to Gage, were forced to commit, but the, quote, false position which woman occupies in civilized society. These women thus push back not on 19th century abortion prohibitions, but on the inattention the male-dominated medical, legal, and political establishments gave to the underlying causes and mitigating factors involved when women sought out abortions. The earliest women's rights advocates knew that if women were to participate fully in the economic and social life of the nation, to take their places as full and equal citizens, as the text of the contemporaneously ratified 14th Amendment anticipated, though did not yet deliver, the nation would have to become far more hospitable to female-bodied human beings who are asymmetrically encumbered by the consequences of sex. But when you belittle the moral status of the unborn child, as Roe and its progeny did, you belittle each and every pregnant woman. For the value of the labor she is undertaking depends not on some subjective measure, but on the intrinsic value of the dependent human being in her care. 50 years into the autonomy-extolling feminist movement, corporate America still engages in rampant pregnancy discrimination, and corporate consultants tout abortion coverage as a means for companies to obtain, quote, high-impact benefit with low-cost investment. More still, so many men continue to abdicate their responsibilities in sex and fatherhood. But why should we be surprised that these men and employers, too, treat the arrival of a child as a woman's inconvenient and burdensome choice, when 50 years of constitutional law treated unborn children that way too? In my view, a half-century of privileging abortion rights as a means to women's equality, liberty, and well-being has obviated the need for a total cultural, familial, and economic transformation on behalf of mothers, especially poor mothers and their children, a deep societal-wide recognition of the reality of human interdependence that 19th century women's rights advocates had only just begun. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next three speakers will offer their vision of the future of abortion in the law and in the courts. So I want to welcome Joanna Erdman, who is Professor of Law and MacBain Chair in Health Law and Policy at the Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie University, and is a specialist in sexual and reproductive health law in a transnational context. Sherif Girgis is Associate Professor of Law at the Notre Dame Law School. His work lies at the intersection of philosophy and law, including criminal law, constitutional law, and jurisprudence. And Melissa Murray is the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Birmingham Women's Leadership Network, New York University School of Law, and a specialist in family law, constitutional law, and reproductive rights and justice. So I'll ask Professor Erdman to join us first.
Thank you. This pill will change everything. Times Magazine once predicted. Abortion pills, all cheeks and tongues and when to swallow. Just let your body do the work. I often think of that magazine cover, and if the future it predicted is yet to come, then how? As a sleight of hand or a trick of mind, or as the newest legal battleground? No, I think it will come in that fateful moment of Roe versus Wade, that moment between me and my doctor. You remember that moment when I spoke to be understood by another rather than as I understood myself. When I presented myself before the law and I took what it held out to me, what we then called the abortion right. This was the law's first violence, to make an abstraction of me, because it made the explicit act of violence so much easier when the right was then taken from me as something that never was, as though there was nobody there. Abortion pills can change everything about that moment. From the clinical trials of these pills, people understood their power. They transfer the skill and the competence of abortion from provider to pill, such that anybody can do an abortion. It is something I can do myself. Imagine a right that comes from the doing of something. What a powerful democratic antidote to the authority of the clinic and the law. But this is no tektopian story. Of course, abortion pills are just things. They have a specific chemical structure that produces biological effects. But how many of us all the time use pills with little information about what they are or how they work? There is an interpretive flexibility to the taking of pills, and then what happens in our bodies when we do. That is, their effects are often related to the expectations we have for them. More than off-label, we use these pills off-script. This is the abortion pill not as an object, but as a provocation of thought. Yes, you can use these pills to have an abortion, but you are also capable of having no abortion at all. Abortions give you that right of silence, a right to withhold the name of your act, a right to see what you are doing in a different way. There are so many ways to describe what is happening in your body. The subtle difference between a pregnancy not taking and the taking of a pregnancy. Pregnancy itself is a highly ambiguous state. I would say a state of mind as much as body. If I do not want to be pregnant, am I? Motherhood has always been a cultural role. It is related to, but it is not defined by our reproductive biology. I am a mother many times, though I have been pregnant never. People make sense of the science of abortion differently across therapeutic cultures, and they do so in the contemplation of their lives and of their futures. I don't think this is a distancing from reality. It is just a different way to know that reality. It is to privilege a part of the experience to which neither medicine nor law can claim knowledge, or has the authority to speak. It is an assemblage of what we know in our body and of what our bodies know. Indeed, in many early studies on the informal use of misoprostol, women did not associate the drug with abortion. They used it to maintain their own health, their blood flow, and their overall well-being. They used it to care for themselves and their families. They used it to find a way through life. For so many, to end a pregnancy is to parent that child. It is an act of love, and yes, these are often tragic acts taken in conditions of injustice. But this is the creative side of abortion. It is the survival side. Abortion as taken as more instinctual living. And the quality of mind for that kind of living, well, no law, no court can give you that, and nor can it take it away from you. And the preserve of all of this is language. We use different words to talk our body such that we may then take flight. Flight from the abstractions of law, the symbolic struggles with no end, that we may refuse abortion as an existential issue of others, that we may be all wrong in the grammar of it. This is the first right. It is the right to hold on to the fantasies of our words, for they are the facts of our bodies. And as somebody, we will recover the abundance of reproductive life. Until then, put abortion pills into people's hands, anyone who needs or wants one, and anyone who can help someone in need. Thank you very much. And now, Sherif Girgis to speak.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This has been, I think, a model of bringing intellectual integrity and empathy and moral seriousness to an issue where it's hard to combine those virtues. As you can tell from my catch-all phrase, I didn't really know what I wanted to talk about when they asked us. And what I've settled on is a mostly predictive point about the future of the issue in courts, which is that as the abortion issue continues to be litigated, the distinctly legal arguments will bring us back over and over to the moral and policy question that used to be at the center of the debate for both sides, and that the pro-life side continues to foreground. So start with religious liberty. Many women have filed lawsuits already arguing that abortion bans in their states substantially burden their religion. And while some conservative commentators have dismissed that argument, I think they're wrong to dismiss it. While it's not enough to say that your religion permits abortion, I think some women's religion may well compel them to get an abortion, maybe out of a sense of obligation to other family members. But even if they just strongly urge you to get an abortion over any alternative, I think a substantial burden has been shown, which then shifts the question to whether the state can establish a compelling interest in enforcing the ban anyway. And it's hard to have that conversation without talking about the moral worth of the fetus, which is the state's main asserted interest in these bans. Or take the equal protection argument, what's emerged as the strongest scholarly argument for the outcome in Roe. In one version, it says that abortion bans impose a burden on women that they would never impose on men if the tables were turned. The states would respond that that's not true because you can't point to a place where they would be willing to lift a burden from men at the cost of doing something like withdrawing the protection of homicide laws from a class of innocence. So to say that they really are imposing a double standard, we would have to show that the fetus is not really innocent human life. We would have to engage the moral worth question. Or another version of the argument contends that abortion bans are invidious discrimination against women because they rest on an invidious stereotype or norm or expectation, that it's women's job to perform motherhood, that they have an obligation to carry a pregnancy to term. That idea would not be constitutionally problematic if it depended on two other ideas that were okay. One, that parents have an enforceable duty to avoid causing the death of their children, and two, that the fetus is a child, the equivalent of a person. So here again, to complete the equal protection argument, you'd have to engage the question of the moral worth of the fetus, and at least whether it's constitutionally permissible for states to affirm that worth. And what's striking is that this was exactly the premise of Roe's reasoning that it was most widely criticized for, including by the liberal constitutional lights of their generation, who were personally pro-choice, John Hart Ely of Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, and Larry Tribe of Harvard. When Ely said that Roe is bad constitutional law because it's not constitutional law and gives almost no sense of an obligation to try to be, I think that's a quote. When Tribe said that behind Roe's verbal smokescreen, the basis for its judgment is nowhere to be found, they were focused on this idea, the idea that the Constitution itself, the Due Process Clause, something else in the 14th Amendment, takes a position on the abstruse moral question of the moral worth of the fetus. And a position in particular that's found nowhere in our history or traditions or any other legal seeming source. It was that seemed to be the weakest premise of Roe, which means that it would be the weakest premise of the arguments to come, unless there's an alternative, unless you can show an independent constitutional problem with states treating the fetus as anything morally like a person. And Professor Tribe's own proposal was to rest on the Establishment Clause. The idea that states that treat the fetus as a person or something equivalent are imposing a religious dogma on society. It's a serious argument. In response, pro-lifers will be likely to point first to atheist pro-life organizations and advocates and movement leaders and even bioethicists. But when push comes to shove, they will ultimately have to rehearse their primary argument, the argument that, as I said, has been foregrounded from the beginning of the movement, which is that the affirmation of fetal moral worth is no more distinctly religious than the affirmation of fundamental human equality. Why is that? Well, you and I have moral worth in one of two ways, either in virtue of the kind of thing we are, and what we are is fill in the blank, human beings, beings of a rational nature, rational animals that come to be at the conception of that animal, or we have it in virtue of what we have, in virtue of having acquired a certain trait to a certain degree. For the pro-choice side, it has to be the latter. But if it's in virtue of something we have to different degrees, it would seem to follow that our moral worth differs from person to person, even among the people who are born. And there are some pro-choice scholars who would agree. Peter Singer, my old professor at Princeton, says that it's no more religious to think that the newborn has moral worth than to think that the fetus does. It crept up in Rome only with Christian ethics, and it's no more superstitious to think that the newborn counts than that the fetus counts, because they're in similar positions with respect to the intellectual capacities that make for personhood. And when I asked him once, well, does that mean that people who have those capacities more, even after birth, even after 1 year of age, count more than others? He said, yes. So the pro-life conceit, the conceit of the whole movement, is that fundamental moral equality, if that's rationally permissible, then so is the moral counting of fetal life. Now, there are obviously strong counter-arguments and counter-arguments to make, and it kills me as a philosophy guy not to be able to rehearse them right now. But in a way, that's the point. The point is that the legal arguments, both Roe's, which was condemned widely, including by Roe's supporters, for resting on a moral premise it could not defend, as well as all the arguments that are supposed to supersede it and that I predict we will see in litigation in the future, all ultimately come back to that one very vexing moral question, and one that I'm very grateful to have been a part of a conference that's done such an amazing job at airing. Thank you, and I'm very happy to invite Melissa Murray.
Thanks so much for the Radcliffe Institute for hosting this conversation. I will just say, I think 7 minutes is exactly the right amount of time to say something that will go viral, but not enough time to call your PR specialist. Okay, so I'll just preface all of this. I want to talk about democracy and Dobbs, and that's a pretty salient concept given that Justice Samuel Alito's majority opinion in Dobbs insists that it is the time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elected representatives. On this account, the court's decision overruling almost 50 years' worth of precedent does no more than rightfully return the fraught question of abortion to the people and the prospect of democratic deliberation. Yet, even as it purports to return the question of abortion to the democratic process, the Dobbs majority opinion subscribes to an extraordinarily myopic conception of democracy. First, when the Dobbs majority discusses democracy, it focuses almost exclusively on state legislatures, repeatedly invoking these bodies as the paradigmatic representation of democracy. Yet, as a result of gerrymandering, state legislatures are often the least representative institutions in state government. And the court's emphasis on state legislatures as arbiters of democracy belies the role that state courts may play in interpreting state constitutional provisions to protect reproductive rights, as well as the roles that state executive officials, governors, and attorneys general may play in enforcing and vetoing restrictive abortion policies. And critically, in many states, these judges and executive actors run for office statewide and are elected by many more voters than the average member of a state legislature. In addition to its inattention to these constitutional actors, the Dobbs court is also conspicuously inattentive to the prospect of direct democracy. And as we know, post-Dobbs, a number of states have used ballot initiatives and voter referenda to protect reproductive rights. The Dobbs majority's neglect of these other state-level constitutional actors and the prospect of direct democracy yields another form of myopia, directional myopia. The court understands democratic deliberation on abortion to proceed in only one direction, the further curtailment of abortion rights. It doesn't even consider the possibility that democratic deliberation might lead to the preservation or the expansion of reproductive freedom. And that is especially curious given the majority's repeated reminders that before Roe, debate was occurring at the state level and proponents of liberal abortion rights had succeeded in some measure in persuading others of the rightness of their cause. But another way that we might understand the Dobbs majority opinion as myopic is in its understanding of what constitutes political power, which the majority reduces to the mere act of voting or perhaps running for political office. As Justice Alito notes, when it comes to participation, women are registered to vote and turn out to vote at higher rates than men. But even putting to the side the significant obstacles that women, who are often the primary caregivers in the family, must surmount to actually exercise the franchise or run for political office, if we use any metric beyond simply voting to measure democratic participation, the empirical portrait looks decidedly different. Women are grossly underrepresented in state legislatures and Congress. They are also grossly unrepresented in state and federal executive positions and state and federal judicial posts. They are woefully underrepresented in the ecosystem that surrounds politics. They are a minority of federal lobbyists, and they donate to political campaigns at far lower rates than men. In addition to misapprehending the complexities of political power, the court's vision of democratic deliberation prioritizes and privileges moments of democratic debate that included only some members of the political community. For example, when the Dobbs majority insists that Roe interrupted state-level debate and deliberation on abortion rights, it is often referring to mid-century debates over whether to repeal or liberalize then-extant abortion restrictions. What's missing from this account is the fact that the laws and policies being debated were enacted through democratic processes that were categorically closed to all but white men. On this account, the debates that Roe preempted and that the Dobbs majority prioritizes and now seeks to vindicate in returning the abortion question to the states were debates over whether to retain or liberalize laws enacted under conditions of extreme democratic deficit. Relatedly, the history and tradition method that the court uses to hold that the Constitution does not protect a right to abortion reveals its hollow commitment to democracy. The Dobbs court's attention to history and tradition consists primarily of examining a slew of mid-19th century statutes enacted during a wave of nativist furor aimed at increasing the birth rate among native-born white women. And again, the laws that the majority cites here were enacted in an era in which women could not vote, could not hold political office, and were not understood as full and equal members of the polity. Put differently, the Dobbs majority's method of analysis and interpretation binds the contemporary meaning of the Constitution to a body of law and authority in whose enactment and creation neither women nor people of color played any part. Dobbs' hollow commitment to democracy is even more pronounced when considered alongside the court's other interventions, which have actively distorted and disrupted the landscape of democracy. Indeed, Dobbs arrives in the wake of a series of high court decisions that have blessed partisan gerrymandering, hobbled the Voting Rights Act, and made our democracy decidedly less representative and less democratic. Focusing on the Dobbs majority's crabbed vision of democracy then reveals a more profound truth about this opinion, that the court's democratic deliberation settlement is merely a way station en route to a final destination, the total abolition of legal abortion in the United States. In this regard, the invocation of democratic deliberation is merely a strategic step that deploys the vernacular and values of democracy as cover, while it seeks to shift political dynamics to desensitize the populace to a more lasting deprivation of access to legal abortion. Thank you.
I'd like now to welcome our final three speakers who are gathered around the broad subject of visions of the future of care and the clinic. Louise P. King is Assistant Professor of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Biology at the Harvard Medical School. Within medical ethics, she focuses on informed decision-making and assisted reproduction, as well as equitable access to advanced gynecologic surgery. Charles Camosy is Professor of Medical Humanities at Creighton University, School of Medicine, and the Monsignor Michael J. Curran Fellow of Moral Theology at St. Joseph's Seminary and College. His work aims to use moral theology toward finding common ground. And Monica McLemore is Professor of Development of the Department of Child, Family, and Population Health and Nursing at the University of Washington School of Nursing. She's a specialist in anti-racist birth equity research, community-informed methods, and policy translation. I'd like to invite Louise King to the podium.
I was asked to pick one word to encapsulate my thoughts for you and my feelings around what I see to be dire clinical ramifications of the Dobbs decision. The first words that ran across my mind as I prepared were death, suffering, injustice, oppression, pain. It got very dark. The image I had in my mind came to me vividly again as I heard in the morning sessions and some others about geopolitical efforts to control women's reproduction and about religious ideas around women's reproduction imposed upon them. That image that racks through my mind is of the patients that I see in my clinic being battered within a circle of policymakers and societal expectations and stigma. Yet, I was also asked to think about the future, and I want to be a bit more positive. So let me think, what underlies where we find ourselves now as clinicians, as persons, as citizens together? I would like to suggest that a loss of trust is at the center of the issues we face. Regaining trust may be the way forward for us. Certainly, I have lost almost all trust in our judiciary and in some of our legislators and in some conservatives who seem to have put aside intellectual honesty to achieve their goal of overturning Roe. We've heard that the Dobbs court assertion that they must send the question of the legality of abortion to the states is deceitful, to quote Professor Bridges. I agree. This is the result in part of restrictive voting laws that we've just heard of and practices in our country. But it also is the result of loss of trust. Our Supreme Court and some legislators have in recent decades developed a tendency to ignore the expertise offered by epidemiologists, sociologists, historians, medical professionals, and many others when legislating and ruling on abortion. They also ignore the opinion of people. One glaring example was the ruling in Gonzalez versus Carhart, in which the court essentially substituted Congress's assessment of what is medically necessary while creating the nonsensical term partial birth. I was in my first year of obstetrics and gynecology residency in Texas when that decision was rendered, and I immediately knew that we were starting down a very difficult road. Similarly, in Dobbs, Justice Alito and even this conference starts by the opinion that we have somehow a sharply divided American populace around this issue. But in my experience in clinics here in California, in the South, the reality is very different, and reliable data from methodologically sound studies show that 80% of Americans feel that abortion should be allowed under some, but not all circumstances. Maybe as much as 60% would allow abortion without restriction. We can't agree completely about the lines that we might draw, but I do believe Americans seem to agree and understand that abortion is essential medical care, and I believe they're correct on this point. Americans, on the whole, trust doctors and patients, their fellow citizens, to make nuanced decisions around reproduction. This is hardly a state of a majority with sharply conflicting views. The Dobbs ruling goes on to hold, at least from the perspective of a clinician, that pregnant persons no longer have a right to protect themselves from bodily harm. This is based on what I see to be a somewhat bizarre notion that a central document to our democracy should be read so strictly as to not extend a right to bodily autonomy to pregnant persons. Corporations are people deserving of constitutional protections, but pregnant persons are not. Current legislation that restricts delivery of essential medical care to any person who is pregnant makes me question my status as a person here today before you, makes me question the status of my daughters and my patients, my fellow citizens. You've heard from multiple speakers about the risks of morbidity and mortality associated with pregnancy and the extreme additional burdens of morbidity and mortality that persons of color bear in this country. You've heard that most maternal deaths are preventable, but I must caution you as a clinician, many are not, and a large proportion of the morbidity in obstetrics is not preventable. Taking on the risks of pregnancy is and should be a profound undertaking with careful thought. Pregnancy remains a dangerous proposition, and simply by virtue of the biologic processes in play, it will always remain dangerous. I don't believe that the developing embryo or fetus is a person. This statement comports with my own religious views. I'm Jewish. But more importantly, it comports with my understanding as a clinician and scientist of biology, embryology, neurology, and genetics. Yet, I deeply value the opinions of others, so I listen carefully to my students and colleagues who tell me I'm wrong. And I disagree, but I accept their views for the purposes of our discussion. And from there, I move on to say that even if I accept an embryo or a developing fetus as a person deserving of the same protections as the pregnant person in front of me, my patient, based on my clinical knowledge, I would not put the embryo or fetus's interests above those of the pregnant person's care. The complication rates in pregnancy and delivery are much higher than those I might incur if I were to donate blood or a kidney or a part of my liver to my own child, yet none of you would force me to donate of myself in that way. And I can't even be forced to donate any organ to my family members after my death. Maternal morbidity and mortality in this country is exceptionally and embarrassingly high, as you've heard, in large part because we do not provide our citizens the preventative health care they need. They begin their pregnancies with an underlying medical condition in many instances, and this contributes along with other factors to morbidity and mortality. So with Dobbs in place, we not only fail to provide appropriate preventative care for our patients, but we also force them to undertake excessive risk. My legal colleagues posit that under restrictive laws, I could interpret saving the life very broadly, and still some form of necessary abortion could continue, but this isn't true. If I practice in a state with restrictive laws, I'd be no longer able to offer the standard of care to pregnant persons presenting with cancer or potentially presenting with cardiovascular disease that requires a life-saving procedure early in their course. Similar issues would exist if they had pre-existing conditions who required teratogenic medications to control, and thus the pregnancy would be compromised and the fetus would experience malformations. Or simply any pregnant person who is otherwise healthy but runs the risk of amniotic fluid embolism, a rare but completely fatal condition that is completely unpredictable and can affect anyone. Every pregnant person is at risk. As Americans, you devote a significant amount of money and resources to train me and to train other doctors and scientists. Yet legislators and justices seem to ignore almost completely the evidence that we've gathered through that investment. This is not to say that Americans universally trust doctors. There are many instances in which we have behaved very badly, and so trust is not uniform at all. But yet we are routinely listed as some of the most trusted professionals in this country. I believe that what we need to recover is trust of legislators and the judiciary for medical professionals and scientists and the evidence that we produce. When we say to you that this condition that we are in currently is exceptionally dangerous, we mean just that. And as abortion is essential health care, I hope that they will begin to listen. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Camosi.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers first for their courage in putting this conference together. So many folks, even many people of goodwill here today, find themselves in ideological bubbles, which make us fundamentally strange to each other, I think. What a gift you've given us to step outside of those bubbles, if for a short time. Two trends now underway have led me to focus my brief remarks on radical equality. The first is a move, at least in the mainstream abortion debate, away from rhetoric which hides the biological humanity of the prenatal child. And the second is a change in the pro-life movement and the GOP away from Reaganite fusionism and an ideological focus on small government. I'll briefly discuss each. I was struck by a Washington Post article last week about some of the underground networks now forming to get abortion pills to people living in areas where they are no longer legal. When discussing the context in which they offer the pill to women beyond the 10-week limit coming from the experts at the FDA, we learned that the distributor refers such cases to an abortion doula who counsels them over text about exactly what they will see. A 12-week baby is roughly the size of a plum, the article says. A 15-week baby the size of an apple. They quoted the doula saying, quote, "I try to emotionally prepare them and say, it's going to look like a baby," end quote. It isn't often that one gets that kind of honesty from places like the Washington Post on this issue, but it is a clear sign that those who want to deny the prenatal child is killed by abortion as anything other than a human baby will not win the future. This trend will continue, especially as clinical and other technologies make the prenatal child's biological reality available to all and in dramatic ways, even at the very earliest stages. I even hold out some hope that we'll be forced to confront the biological fact that at 6 to 7 weeks gestation, a mother's baby has a 4-chambered heart pumping blood unidirectionally, as every embryology student knows. In addition, the massive and exponential decline in fertility and population currently underway, and the massive and exponential desperation so many individuals and cultures and states will have with regard to having more babies in the future will lead to a very explicit thought about the reality and goodness, shift in the thought about the reality and goodness of the prenatal human being going forward. Economics, for better or for worse, drives much of a culture's morality and policy, and future economic concerns are pronatalist. So the future points to an acknowledgement that who is killed in an abortion is a human baby. I am a student of the works of Peter Singer, who was mentioned, but I hope we're aware of the fact that with the overwhelming majority of regular folks in this debate, once you have a baby, it's game over for the moral status debate. Don't get me wrong, I love to go at it strong in arguments about speciesism, abortion, and infanticide. It's made a lot of my career, but they just don't track outside of the academy. Once you have a baby, justice, including prenatal justice, and social equality follow. But a prenatal child finds herself obviously in a remarkable relationship with someone else who also has moral, legal, and social equality. A relationship of remarkable, sometimes burden, but also cooperation. In fact, a mother and a child grow and share an organ together. It's absolutely remarkable. The pro-life movement has always made women a priority, and claims that we only care about people before they're born are profoundly unserious. But I've spent my career arguing that our movement overall has been led for a generation by far too tight connections with the Republican Party that has largely rejected the role of government in favor of private solutions. There is nothing about this approach, let us be clear, that is pro-life. We, of course, need to make informed and prudential judgments about the often unintended consequences of particular policies, but we must fully divest from any sort of a priori arguments or commitments to small government. We need an all-of-the-above approach. And if you think the pro-life movement can't be motivated to do that, I refer you to a debate over the 2017 budget when Paul Ryan and company tried to avoid picking winners and losers, which included getting rid of the adoption tax credit. You remember that? Pro-lifers went to war and defeated it. We need to do that again on many other issues. And to make this case, I want to call the pro-life movement just before Roe, as Dan Williams mentioned, pro-life 1.0 for making my point here. It was a very diverse movement, as we heard, which included anti-war activists who also hated the violence of abortion. With Reaganite fusionism, we had pro-life 2.0. That's gone. That's been destroyed. Perhaps some of you saw a New York Times article covering a statement I helped put together explicitly focused on social and structural supports for vulnerable women and families. It was signed by a wide range of pro-life leaders, everyone from Lila Rose to Eric Scheidler to Abby Johnson to Russell Moore to Kristen Hawkins to Catherine Glenn Foster and many, many more. The pro-life movement now finds itself on the cusp of our 3.0 version, one which will be poised to have a clear focus on social structural support for mothers at the service of their radical equality. So on the basis of both these trends, I predict a post-Roe future which will focus on radical equality. And of course, acknowledging the full humanity of the prenatal child does not end the abortion debate. We just heard a powerful argument for that. Indeed, most regular folks who ID as pro-choice do not have the supposed non-personhood of a fetus as one of their primary reasons. Indeed, many of those who identify as pro-choice have clear cutoffs in mind when they want abortion broadly illegal, based precisely on the moral status of the baby. We have heard that the disproportionate number of abortions in this country are borne by economically vulnerable people of color, and that is absolutely the case. This, incidentally and importantly, is the same group who is among the most likely to support abortion restrictions, economically vulnerable people of color. It is a horrible thing, indeed, that we explicitly and structurally coerce so many vulnerable women to have abortions that they know are the killings of their own children. There are so many things we could invoke here as reason for this. Many of them has been mentioned. Let me just highlight a few. The relationship between abortion and intimate partner violence, the relationship between abortion and poverty, the relationship between abortion and lack of child care, paid family leave, protections at work, and much more. Happily, we do not have to respond to these vulnerable women by telling them stories they reject that their babies are not their babies, nor do we need to respond to them by telling them stories about how the government that governs best is the government that governs least. We can respond instead with a profound commitment to radical equality, to protect, love, and structurally support them both. Thank you. And now, to bring our session of lightning talks to a close, let us welcome Monica McLemore to the podium.
You know they put me last on purpose. I use she and her pronouns, and I know that comments were made about not having a discussion, but I hope people will join me on social media because my brain is full and I have so many things to say, so I'm going to try to keep the time, but I'm myself everywhere, and I might have to do an Instagram Live after wine. So we're going to retrofit, reform, and reimagine. I'm going to use my time here to reject all the unnecessary binaries of anti-abortion or pro-abortion that we've heard all day today, and to push us to think differently about how we talk about abortion, the people who need them and seek them, the people who provide them, and the clinical, social, political conditions that make them necessary. I'm going to use retrofit, reform, and reimagine, and I have a paper published around it. I'll send you the PDF if you hit me up. To activate curiosity, because we've heard a lot today. I've heard a lot today. Let me just give you an example. Some people center suffering and can't imagine a future without villains, which was completely foreign to me because that's not how I exist in the world. I reject the notion of culture wars because, as we've learned from our trans and non-binary colleagues, participating in binaries is incongruent and not necessary because I'm also rooted in hallmarks of Black feminism and reproductive justice. So we believe in both and there are multiple truths and not just one. But first, positionality. I'm coming to this meeting from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where we were updating the MEC. If you don't know what that is, this is an example, the medical eligibility criteria. It's the document, the app, the tools we use to determine clinical risks for contraception use. So the irony is not lost on me that the importance of that work at the CDC and in a clinician room where we actually had 2 patient participants to come here to a very academic space to talk about abortion as if those two things are not connected. So, positionality. I'm a person who's witnessed 57 births in my life, including my nieces who are at home house sitting for me. Thank you very much and watching on Zoom. I have conscientiously provided abortion care my entire career. I'm a registered nurse by training and a molecularly trained event scientist as a PhD. I'm also a childless by choice who has no idea what I would have to do if I ever had to make a pregnancy decision, and I'm glad I haven't had to, and now I won't have to because I'm menopausal. So, retrofit. The decider. Who gets to decide matters, especially since we trust pregnant people to determine and diagnose themselves with pregnancy, and if their pregnancies are unwanted, missed time, or unintended. We discuss outcomes of pregnancy like abortion, birth, miscarriage, stillbirth, and factors that are associated with the process of pregnancy, like assisted reproductive technology and infertility and surrogacy, but not the condition in and of itself. In the first ever Black maternal health amicus brief in Dobbs, we, Black women, made a simple human rights argument that pregnancy is not without risk, regardless of how it ends, and all pregnancies end. So who gets to decide if, when, and how, and why to take on that risk? Pregnant capable people have to be the primary arbiters in these decisions with the people they trust. Reform. This is a workforce issue. Ethically challenging care, especially in my discipline like nursing, is always buttressed by the perceived capacity to provide excellent nursing care. From my own research, and I'm prolific, you can look it up, nurses wrestle with abortion care similarly as we do with many other things, treating victims and perpetuators of intimate partner violence, athletes who repeatedly expose themselves to physical harm, mass shooters, and the people that they shoot. Which tells me that we as teachers and educators are not preparing future clinicians to meet people where they are because they are experts by experience in their own lives. This is really crucial for the health professions, but more so for my discipline of nursing because nursing is shared work. So let's talk about reimagination. I want to spend my time here because we've heard a lot of doom and gloom, death and dying, and a lot of depressing things, there's nothing we can do about this, but there's many things that we can do. The weekend before last in Atlanta, we've heard this name already, but let me give you some more detail. Sister Song, the Women's Health Reproductive Justice Collective, had it convening, and they released an incredible document called Our Vision and What We Are Fighting For, of which I will read a portion of it. We are dreaming ourselves into the future, fighting like revolutionaries. Our vision is a future rooted in human dignity and worth, bodily autonomy, joy, love, and rest. Reproductive justice is our framework, intersectionality is our lens, and liberation is our goal. We moved forward to present a list of 10 liberatory topics, and so I will read 5 for the sake of time. Liberation is giving the land back to indigenous people who stewarded and protected it for generations before colonization and who live on it today. Liberation is having what you need to keep your kids safe, to care for your kids, and to keep your family safe and together. Liberation is being able to have healthy and supported pregnancy options, prenatal, birth, postpartum care. This is birth justice. Liberation is an end to police, prisons, and detention centers, which are designed to harm Black and brown bodies and break up our families. Liberation is ending the war on drugs and providing physical and mental health care, help, and support for everyone who needs it. Liberation is reparations. Liberation is abortion care for any person who needs it. Reproductive justice leads us to new futures that we don't yet know, but we dare to imagine. We will not be silenced. We will take up all the space and time that we need. We will lead with love, which is why I reject the binary and the war metaphors. We will reclaim our power for ourselves, our beautiful families, our children, and for generations to come. So I have a question for the people in this room, the people watching the Zoom. Now that Roe is gone, Dobbs is the law of the land, what's the plan? What futures are we going to imagine and then construct? I hope you'll join me on social media. I'm Macklemore MR everywhere. And I think I might do a tweet, a Mastodon, and an Instagram Live to continue this conversation. because I reject this as an ending, and I invite you to many new beginnings. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all 9 of our tremendous panelists for those thoughtful, incisive, and wonderfully pithy comments. And it is now my great, great honor to introduce to you the last speaker of this extraordinary gathering, a scholar who I think probably needs no introduction to those of us here and many on Zoom. Mary Ziegler is an expert in the law, history, and politics of reproduction, healthcare, and conservatism in the United States in the 20th century. She's written a slew of vitally important books on the history of this debate, most recently Dollars for Life, the Anti-Abortion Movement, and the Fall of the Republican Establishment. And she has been instrumental in the organizing of this gathering. Please welcome Mary Ziegler.
When Jane and I began this work 3 years ago, my husband asked whether it was a wise idea for me to do it, right? So the idea was, how do you tell the story of the age of Roe? That's what this is called. So I'm 6 books in, and I've yet to crack the code. So to do it in one day, or to do it in one exhibit, I think was impossible from the outset. And then, of course, Roe, which we had intended to commemorate, is now no more. And it became, what, a requiem, a retrospective? What were we doing? I think what we were doing in a way was encountering a fork in the road and realizing now that there are not just one future we could imagine, but multiple futures. And this is a moment to kind of stop and take stock of what future we want and what futures are possible. I think it's important today to notice how little we talked about the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. I was struck time and again by this because we live in a moment where we're told that the Supreme Court gives us rights and the Supreme Court takes away those rights. Where anytime the Supreme Court does anything, I'm asked to explain. And yet when we drill down into the age of Roe, we see very little of the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court is part of a dialogue that's much broader. We've spoken relatively little about Norma McCorvey, whose captivating and contradictory story can be found in papers held in the archive at the Schlesinger. I think what we've seen is something that goes beyond a story in a single book. It's a story that goes beyond a single discipline, as we've seen here, whether that's law or history or medicine or sociology or political science. When you look at this past and the futures, you see stories that are instantly familiar to you from images in the media and histories. But if you press on, you find stories we've often ignored, the voices we find uncomfortable, the people who are at the margins, the voices of people who experience abortion rather than writing about it, thinking about it, or fighting about it. You'd want to peer inside the clinic to see the medical side of abortion and how law and politics and protest have irrevocably altered what that looks like. You would consider the role of faith in abortion and see unexpected ideas about faith and who considers themselves a person of faith in a debate where that's so often meant one thing to the exclusion of many others. You couldn't avoid the extent to which abortion has shaped party politics, sometimes for ill better than good, so much so that ideas about Roe, I think, often serve as a shorthand for our deepest divides. But you would also see how none of those political alignments were or are inevitable. You would see that those political divides sometimes don't run as deep as you first may think. You would remember often, too, how far removed those partisan debates are from how many Americans view abortion, and even further removed from the lives of people who are considering it. You would think carefully about when this age of Roe began, and whether it has ended at all, which I question, and if so, at what cost. So if you looked at this era then, what would you see? I think in some ways you would see a version of the conversations we've been having here for the past few days. What you would see would be contentious, I think often painfully so, as it has been for me. You would see disagreements about who or what we are as a nation and what we want to become. You would see disagreement about basic facts and even what constitutes a fact. You would reconsider what it means potentially to be progressive or conservative, or whether these categories are helpful, just as the same would be true of pro-life or pro-choice. You would see conversations about the kind of democracy we want to have, the role of the judiciary in our democracy, the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, the role of the government should play, if any, in steering decisions about reproduction. You would see debates about justice, and primarily racial justice, given that it is Black women and people of color who are the most affected by the changes Dobbs has wrought. You would see, too, I think, a deep distrust between peoples and communities, and a shared sense that whatever comes next should be, indeed must be, better than what has come before. Often you would see these conversations happening separately between people who already agree with one another. Indeed, this is where I've been having most of these conversations. But I think as a historian, if we were to understand where we have been and where we are going, it's important to hear the people with whom we don't agree and to see what they have to offer, if anything. It may be that what they have to offer confirms even more firmly our own passions and our commitments to our views of justice. It may be that we change our minds. It may be simply that we know more accurately who is in this we the people that has been conducting this conversation for the past 50 years and more. And so when you look at the age of Roe, I think you would see something cacophonous and complicated. You would see something that is much bigger than abortion. You would see a broad cross-section of Americans who are passionately engaged and indeed consumed by an issue that many outside of our borders and within it believes defines us as a people, politically, constitutionally, and culturally. You would see what Harry Blackmun, the author of Roe, learned the hard way and indeed much too late, and what Samuel Alito will learn soon enough, which is that this is much bigger than the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court could never settle this once and for all, that this is bigger than abortion, bigger than due process, bigger than the judiciary, and well beyond anything the justices that can control. It's as rich and sweeping as the debates and visions you've heard here, and it's as small and fundamental as the story of a single person who's pregnant and confronting what all of this means to them. I thank you for listening to these stories and sticking with it today, even when it is much easier, as we so always do, to look away. So I wanted to thank, of course, there's so many people to thank, Jessica Vicklin and Rebecca Wasserman, who've made this all so seamless, Jenny Gottwals and others who helped me, a hopelessly inexperienced curator, attempt something like curation of the exhibit, Jane Kamensky, my partner in crime, in this kind of tight wire act we've been performing for the past few days, and of course, you, our audience, online and in person, for, I think, hanging in there for what have been difficult but hopefully generative conversations. Recordings of the conference sessions will be posted in the coming weeks on the Radcliffe website, radcliffe.harvard.edu, where viewers can also find information about future Radcliffe events. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a lovely weekend and take care.